Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham and the subject here is sharpening images. If we made a list of techniques that have the potential to do more harm to our images than good, then this topic would be way up there near the top. The sharpening of images must be done with extreme care, because it's very easy to over sharpen them and damage the very appeal that we're looking for. This is a personal view, but I would argue that we should wait and sharpen the image when we know exactly what we intend to do with that image. For example, we wouldn't sharpen a high resolution image for printing the same as we may do for a low resolution one for an email attachment, a slideshow, or maybe for placing on a website. Many people say that all digital images can be improved with a little extra sharpness. But I would ask you to take a look at our galleries on Flickr, which these days is called SmugMug, with the knowledge that none of them have been sharpened at all. And one thing we do need to remember is we cannot sharpen blurred images. But sharpness isn't all down to just the sharpen tools either. We can have great impact with our sharpness by just making sure we get the contrast, color and clarity right in Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop. An image that has a good tonal range, great color and contrast, can often appear much sharper than one that has very weak tones and it lacks contrast. Now we can sharpen in Adobe Camera Raw and in Photoshop, and here we're going to take a look at 3 of the sharpening options we have, 1 in Raw and 2 in Photoshop. Now as you can see here, I've got a raw image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw. You can see by the sliders above my cursor that some work has been done. So I've done most of the work that I want to do. If I now want to turn my attention to sharpening the image, what I need to do is to view the image at least 100% magnification. Now we can do that pretty easily just by double clicking the zoom tool. If you look down at the bottom left corner, we can be reassured that it is in fact 100%. I'm going to use the spacebar key here. It just suspends the tool that I've currently got, changes it to the hand tool, just enables me to position the image nicely ready for sharpening. Now what I'm hopeful to do here is to be able to sharpen, and we can see the effects of that probably fairly clearly on that indented panel on the lamp. But we also need to keep our eye on smooth backgrounds like you can see here. So once we're ready to consider sharpening the image, we need to go up to the sharpening tools, and we'll find them in the Detail tab. This tab is made up of 2 sections, noise reduction, and we'll deal with that in a separate video later. But here we're going to look at sharpening alone. Now sharpness works by increasing the contrast of the edge of pixels in our image. The amount, I tend to think of that as a standard volume control. In other words, it'll turn up our sharpness over the entire image. The radius can define that a little more. But what I tend to find in practical use is I either use one or the other. Now I tend to just use the amount, but let's have a look at what we can do with that panel that we're viewing in the center of the screen. You can see by default that the amount of sharpening is set at 40. So if I were to take it down, can we see a difference? Very difficult to see, but let's push this up somewhere to 75 or even 80 there. Now let's take a look at this section here as I double click over on the right. So let's look at the badge itself, we can hardly see any difference there. So what I'm going to do to see if we can do this is to click once more into the picture. I've doubled the magnification to 200%. Now let's try the same thing. Now we can start to see a marginal difference. Can you see that? Let me double click. Slightly softer now, but it is a little bit crisper. Now we can get away with sharpening areas that contain lots of detail probably a little easier than areas that don't. Let's have a look at pushing up the radius. It's usually set around 1. Let's see if we can push this up to 2. And then I'll turn it off or reset it, and we can see the difference between the before and after. You can see that what I'm doing here is very, very marginal, and I think it would be more of a personal choice to decide which one of these we needed to move to get the best result. Do we need more radius and less sharpening, or the other way round? I think that rather depends on the image that you're sharpening. And by the way, we do have a detail slider here, and it said that this is useful when we have lots of detail. Well, I think we possibly could argue we've got just that in that panel. So I'm going to step that up and look very carefully at the panel as I do so, and I can definitely see extra sharpness going in there. Now if we double click, whoops, there's the before, there's the after. So the movement of these is going to be, I think, more of a personal taste. But if we wanted to look at a before and after just of the settings we've made in this panel, if we go down to the bottom right, the tooltip here, if I can read it before it goes off, it says toggle between the current settings and defaults for the visible panel. So I should be able to click and turn off the sharpness here. There you can see, if you're looking at the panel in the middle, you can see the difference, I think, quite clearly. But look at the background to the image over on the right hand side as I turn the sharpness off. You can see that the sharpness here has impacted quite a bit on the smooth tones in the background. Now you can imagine the effect of this if we wanted to add this amount of sharpness into a seascape or a landscape where we had a large amount of sky. Well, what we can do is we can mask off parts of the image to help us to focus the sharpness more where we need it. If we go to the masking option here, I'm going to hold my Alt key, and as I click the slider to move it, you'll notice the picture goes white, but as I move the slider to the right, we can see a change. Now the black areas here are going to be less sharpened, and the white areas are going to take more of the sharpening we've applied. So when I release the masking here, you'll now notice that the background is quite smooth as it was when we started, but we still have the sharpening of the panel on the lamps. Now let me turn this sharpness on and off. There you can see the badge goes a little soft, and the background, as you can see, looks okay. When I turn the sharpness back on again, you can actually see the background doesn't change very much at all. Certainly we've got the background smooth tones protected from the sharpness we've applied. Now imagine if we were going to apply this sort of sharpness to a landscape or seascape that had quite a bit of sky. The last thing we want to do is to add noise into the sky. Now I'm going to hit Control 0, which will fit the image back on screen. It would be nice, wouldn't it, if I could just say, look, when you come into this panel, set the amount at this, the radius at this, the detail at this, and the masking at this, and you'll get a great result. But that's not how image editing works. Every one of our images, as you know, is unique, so we need to deal with it in that way. And we need to take care for the reasons I said in the introduction. Now I suppose when we're dealing with sharpness, one of the positive things I could say about doing this in Adobe Camera Raw is the settings that I've made here are not set in stone, because I can open up this image, and if in the future I decided that perhaps I had overdone the sharpening in Camera Raw, I can go back to my thumbnail, which will remember all of my editing settings until I decide to reset them, and I can open this up exactly where it is now, and I could back off from some of the options I've applied in the detail sharpening above. What we're going to look at here is Smart Sharpen, and then the high pass technique, which I'll demonstrate a little later. First thing we need to do is to bear in mind the resolution of the image we're about to sharpen. Are we sharpening a big image, a high resolution image for print purposes, or have we downsized this image in resolution for a slideshow, maybe an email attachment, or for posting on a website? Well, here I'm going to use a high resolution image. So the first thing we need to do is to get the image up to at least 100%, as we did in Camera Raw. So I'll double click the zoom. We'll click and drag the same as before using the space bar to get an area of the image where we get a good view of the eye, some of the hairs, some of the smooth areas, so at least we get the opportunity to make a valued judgment. If we go to the filters menu and down to sharpen, you can see there's quite a few sharpen options there, but the one we're looking for is Smart Sharpen. And before I forget, we've got a little option here where we can open up another portion of the panel. Now let me place this panel. I'll place it down there because I want to be able to see the eye of the bird. May even move that up a little bit, but I want to be able to see this area over the beak as well. Now we have very similar sliders here to what we saw in Adobe Camera Raw. We have the amount, which I referred to as a volume control. We have the radius of the pixels, and we have a reduction in noise slider. Now once again, I don't think there's any rights or wrongs, but we do have to be extremely careful we don't overdo things. So I'm going to leave the amount set to 200% here. I'm going to increase the radius to 2 pixels. If we look over here where the hairs on the edge of the bird are coming over the yellow of the beak, I think that's a good area for us to evaluate. So if I go to the top of the Smart Sharpen panel and remove the preview tick, if I do that while we look at those hairs, there I've just turned it off. There it's back on. You can see a difference. But now look up at the extreme top left at the out of focus green background. There's the sharpness off. There's the sharpness on. We're not having a great deal of impact on the background, and we're only having a marginal effect here. So the obvious thing to do, I think, is to say, well, if we've got away with 2 pixels, let's go to 3 and do the same thing. Look in the same place, remove the sharpness. Now it's a little bit more evident. When I turn it back on, let's look at those hairs against the yellow. They still look pretty good to me. But now I am just beginning to see some impact on the background up here. Not massively, but I can see it, and probably down here by the hairs underneath the bird's beak. Let's look down there while I turn this off and on. So perhaps I could argue that I've probably reached the limit here, but let's push it further just for an exercise. There we are, up to 4 pixels. Removing the preview, Now the sharpness is considerable in the bird. I'm not going to suggest that the noise in the background is significantly more, between 3 and 4. But I would probably edge this down to number 3 if I was really thinking about sharpening the image. But let's leave it at number 4 just for a moment and investigate what the reduced noise can do. Now we only really want to look at these areas here and here when it comes to the reduction in noise. Now of course with any of these sliders we can pick them up and move them slowly, but sometimes when I'm trying to evaluate a difference, what I tend to do is to move my cursor to somewhere like there and click and look at the area that I want to view, because the change then is instant and it's easier to see. Now that smoothed things out quite a bit. Let's go back down. What did it do to the hairs around the beak of the bird? Did it soften those? Well, it did a little bit, so perhaps I'm going a little too far. So let's just come up. What was the default setting? I think the default setting was 25, so we're very close here to the default setting. So let's just move it up to 42. A little bit more. I think we've smoothed this out a little bit. Let's try it by just stepping it back down, and I can just about see the difference. The one thing I would say is that you have to bear in mind here that you are looking at a slightly compressed video. So I'm going to suggest that perhaps I'm likely to be seeing a little bit more change than perhaps you would in the video that I'm currently recording. Now down below we have a number of sliders to fine-tune the sharpening we want to give. I've opened them up to show you them, but I've never found it that fine that I need to use them at all. I'm going to shut them down. Now we do have the opportunity to remove different types of blur. It does seem an odd thing, doesn't it, to be talking about blur with a tool that's sharpening our images. I've also read that lens blur is going to meet most of our needs most of the time, but let's take a quick look at the other two options, starting with Gaussian blur. If we just look at the bird's beak, where those hairs are just sticking out over the top as I select it, you can see that that seems to have taken the sharpness a little bit too far. If I go to motion blur, that I don't like the effect of at all. So I think the information I've read from Photoshop itself, that lens blur is going to meet most of our needs, seems to be borne out here. So I would be willing to click OK and live with that sharpness. Now the spinning round of the screen indicates that I've opened up my original golden eagle shot. This is the one that hasn't had any sharpness placed within it. I've also opened up my layers on the right hand side, because what I want to do here, I'm going to make a copy of the image that I have on screen. We can drag the thumbnail from here down over the copy icon to do that, but Ctrl J is the quick and easy way to do it. Using the top layer, we need to go to our filter menu, other, high pass. Now you're going to need a little bit of experimentation here to decide how much radius you're going to include. Because I want to demonstrate the tool working, I'm going to err on the heavy side, but I emphasize that's not a great thing to do when we're sharpening images. Let me just move this up a little bit. Oh, that's far too much. I think I'll overtype that. Sometimes I find it just as quick to overtype the value. I'm going to live with a 20 pixel radius. Once I click OK, I have to blend this layer with this one, and we're going to use this option here, overlay. Now what I'm also going to do is double click to bring this up to 100%. Now you probably can see already that we're having a considerable effect here, and we can tell the difference because we can just turn off that layer we created and we can see a before and after. Now I'm going to suggest that that's probably overdone, and very likely because I put too much in the radius in the layer here. So I could use my undo history and correct that, but it does give me the opportunity to show you another way we can reduce the impact, because we can drop the opacity of just this layer so that it has less sharpening impact on the image beneath. So all I need to do here is to get my opacity, maybe take it all the way off, and then take it up a third, and there I can see some difference. Let me snap it off. Let's take it up to half, and there we can see a considerable difference, and snap it off. If I go over half, I think that's where I may be drifting into more sharpness than I need. So I'm going to suggest that, given the fact that I was very heavy-handed with the radius, I'm going to suggest that that would probably meet our needs. Control 0 will fit the image back on screen, and once again a different method to sharpen the image. Once we are happy with this, of course, we would go here and we would flatten those two layers together. Earlier on in my video I suggested that if we were going to sharpen an image, we maybe need to take into account what we're going to use that image for. And I've also said that we need to bear in mind the resolution of the image that we're about to sharpen. Perhaps I should bring this video to a close by just expanding on that a little bit. What I've got here is my original eagle opened up on screen, but the difference here is this image has been resized down to a HD size of 1920 pixels by 1080. Now that's been done, let's assume, to include this image in a slideshow, send it as an email attachment, or even post on a website. Let's have a look at applying exactly the same settings that we applied to the Golden Eagle previously when it was high resolution. Now when we did this before, I suggested we double click the zoom tool to increase the size of the image to 100%. I'm going to do that here, but you will notice a considerable difference. We had a much bigger magnification last time, and of course that's why I was mentioning that we need to bear in mind the resolution of the image that we're creating. So perhaps here I'll just bring this up one more click, so I've got it 200%. Now I can go and get Filter, Sharpen, and Smart Sharpen. Now the last time we used this, I believe we used 200%, and I think we actually had 4 or 3 in here, but you can quite clearly see that the same settings, or even similar settings to the ones we used in our high resolution version, are way over the top. So I think that demonstrates pretty clearly how we have to take into account the resolution of the image we're working on. I'm going to take my radius here down to a level of 1, and then I would be doing much the same as I did before. I would be looking very critically at the image by turning on and off the preview, but of course we do have to bear in mind the resolution of this image, because I can start to see some jagged edges alongside these hairs, but I can see those because I'm actually looking at the picture larger than it was designed to be viewed at. So I suppose in one respect we could argue perhaps we're better looking at this at 100%, but the trouble with that is we have trouble seeing the detail. So I think it's fair enough here to look at it slightly larger than we intend it to be seen, just to make our evaluation on the sharpness we're prepared to give. And I think I would probably go down to 1 so you can see the difference between the low and the high resolution images. Have you enjoyed this topic? Of course you have, you're still here. Now, seeing that you're still with me, here's a parting shot. You're better off not sharpening your images at all, rather than overdoing it.